Welcome to the Film Studies Center. I'm Miriam Hansen, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Laura Mulvey, who is the 2010 Schaffner Visiting Professor in Cinema and Media Studies. First off, let me thank the Nicholson Center for British Studies, in particular Braden Cormack in absentia, for bringing Laura to Chicago this quarter. And Kristen Luker for setting up this event. Thanks also to the Film Studies Center, in particular Sabina Craig and Chloe Connolly, for hosting it. Laura Mulvey is Professor of Film and Media Studies at Birkbeck College, University of London, a program she was instrumental in building up. Laura is the author of innumerable articles, part of which are collected in Visual and Other Pleasures, 1989, and Fetishism and Curiosity, 1996. She has also written a wonderful monograph on Citizen Kane, and more recently published a book called Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image, a reflection on modes of spectatorship and practices of film history and on film analysis in the digital age. Together with her husband, Peter Woolen, Laura made a number of experimental films, of which probably Riddles of the Sphinx, 1977, is the best known. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to, and now I have to.
Oh yes, you've got to show Exhibit A.
Exhibit.
Yeah.
I'd like to draw attention to the second edition of Visual and Other Pleasures, published last year, which contains an illuminating new preface and an additional essay devoted to the flapper phenomenon of the 1920s and its implications for feminist film theory, a new area of Laura's work of which we will get a sample today. I hardly have to tell you that Laura is internationally renowned for her pioneering work in feminist film theory, which has exerted enormous influence in cinema studies and art history worldwide. Since today's lecture is concerned with British film history, and particular configurations of femininity, class, and race, I'd like to briefly evoke the intellectual, political, and cultural force field of the 1970s, from which Laura's work emerged. I'm thinking of two major interconnected nodal points. One being the women's liberation movement and efforts to link feminist politics with psychoanalysis and leftist politics, and to make it productive in cinema, avant-garde art, and theater. And the site of this, as many of you know, was for many years the Edinburgh Festival, and beginning with the publication of the Edinburgh magazine devoted to psychoanalysis, cinema, avant-garde, there was a focus on precisely those interests. The second major nodal point was British cinephilia, the collective addiction to movie-going that found expression in such magazines as Movie and the more mainstream Sight and Sound. As Laura points out, no?
Not Sight and Sound.
Not Sight and Sound.
No, Movie certainly. Sorry to be pedantic. Yes, yes, yeah.
As Laura points out in her new preface to Visual and Other Pleasures, by the 1960s, cinephilia was inseparable from francophilia. In the spirit of the politique des auteurs and the fledgling new wave, British cinephiles rediscovered Hollywood movies of the studio era, preferably B films, and culturally ill-respected genres such as melodrama. However, when in the wake of the political upheavals of around 1968, Godard and others radicalized the politique des auteurs into what David Roderick has dubbed political modernism, and when periodicals such as Cahiers du Cinéma and Cinétique developed a critique of ideology inspired by Althusserian Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis, classical Hollywood cinema became the major target of that critique. And the British journal Screen emerged as one of the major sites for English language translation and elaboration of these theoretical positions by writers like Stephen Heath, Willeman, Wollen, among others. Post-structuralist film theory was no longer concerned simply with representational ideology or ideologies of representation, but rather with the question of the subject with a capital S, the question of how the cinema, qua apparatus and narrational system, allowed the viewer to assume the position of a transcendental subject, channeling desire into an imaginary sense of mastery and self-identity. Now, Laura famously intervened in these debates by questioning the ostensible neutrality of philosophical and psychoanalytic concepts of the subject as imported into film theory, arguing that in cinema, classical Hollywood cinema in particular, subjecthood and desire were inevitably gendered, and that the pleasures offered to the spectator were predicated on traditionally male perversions of voyeurism and fetishism, and a patriarchal economy of vision and desire that made woman both an alluring threat and the subjugated object of looking relations and narrative action. If the position of the spectator was thus automatically masculinized, whatever the empirical viewer's gender and preference, the radical conclusion for feminists was to turn their backs on classical cinema and to call for a destruction of visual pleasure. What obviously fell by the wayside was cinephilia, along with the question of why, nonetheless, women were going to the movies, especially during the 1920s, when, according to some estimates, they made up 80% of the audience. In her recent work, Laura has returned to that question in conjunction with greater attention to the economic and social aspects of gender desire and to cinema's historic role as site and record of 20th century quotidian modernity. In her essay on the flapper film, she shows how the young modern woman functioned as both energetic emblem of liberalization and an embodiment of the contradictions of modernization, and how the films gave vision and narrative to difficulties that could not be resolved in the real world. The modern girl was a powerful figure and addressee, not just in silent Hollywood film, but traveled around the world, finding translatable yet locally specific incarnations in European, Asian, and Latin American cinemas. This is the point where I should yield to Laura, who will discuss two particularly fascinating examples of flapper figures in British cinema, flapper films in British cinema, Hindle Wakes and Piccadilly. The title of her lecture is The Purposes of Love, Romance in Two British Films of the Late Silent Period. Please join me in welcoming Laura Mulvey.
Well, Miriam, that was a wonderful introduction, hard to follow, but very apposite characterization of the way I want to try and approach these two movies. But I'd first like also to echo Miriam's thanks to the Nicholson Centre and thank them very much for having me here. And also very many thanks to everyone who's helped me get this lecture together, and particularly Chloe Connolly, who is not here. Is here? Around. And Todd, who's helping me with the clips. Now, I'm very pleased that Miriam introduced this question of vernacular modernism, not only because it's an apposite context for my lecture this evening, but also because when the Nicholson Centre originally invited me to give this talk and told me it should be on a British topic, I dithered about what kind of approach I would be able to take up. And I thought of a number of different ideas, topics, etc. And then I remembered that not the last time I was here, but the time before, in this very room, was for a day which was held as a tribute to Miriam's work on vernacular modernism, which was actually the first time that I ever tried out my flapper material. And so I decided that I would try and do a part 2, as it were, to that day, and go back to the flapper film, though this is only marginally flapper film, but to questions that relate to vernacular modernism. So I see this as the purposes of love, but also part 2 of that particular occasion. Also, I was very struck by the way in which the Nicholson Centre is devoted to British culture very generally. And I wanted to point out that although this isn't really coming up in my talk, both the films, Hindle Wakes and Piccadilly, have some kind of literary associations. Hindle Wakes was adapted from Stanley Houghton's 1912 realist play. It was one of the most acclaimed of the Manchester School, as it was known then. And the Manchester School was particularly influenced by European realism and the plays of Ibsen. Piccadilly was written, intertitles included, by Arnold Bennett, who was one of the most successful English novelists of his time. Now, I've approached this question of purposes of love, in relation to the representation of love in Hindle Wakes and Piccadilly, from 3 different perspectives. First of all, I want to think about the film's depictions of various key topographies, how space inhabits the film's plots, and particularly the significance in both of entertainment and pleasure sites. I want to suggest that these sites were an effect of new modern femininity and functioned, using Foucault's term, as heterotopias, in which modern sexual relations could be enjoyed and negotiated. These films are very English in their settings and stories, but they're also emblematic of contemporary tension in national cinemas. That was, and this is I'm going to come back to in my second perspective, how to make films that would be relevant to a nation's own citizens, but could also find a language often referred to at the time, which I'm afraid now sounds very archaic and anachronistic, but referred to as universal, that would help films to travel internationally and so have a double address, both internally to the nation and also externally to other markets. So how, and in these 2 cases, how these love stories that feature couples from diverse social and ethnic backgrounds emerge symptomatically at a moment when British cinema industrially was reaching towards Europe, and European cinema was itself attempting to cross national barriers. So that's my second point. Finally, I want to come back to the films themselves, consider the question of content, how the film stories, how the nature of love in each chimes with a contemporary modernity, but the way in which the modernity also affects narrative pattern, over determining the erotic discourse possible endings. Now, I want to say at the very beginning that throughout my talk, Piccadilly is actually more central to my focus because of the film's production values, its thematic complexity, and its tour de force direction, which I hope you will see when I show a few extracts which will come up soon. And then, of course, the qualities of its star, Anna May Wong. All these far outweigh the qualities of Hindle Wakes. But however, I do hope to demonstrate that Hindle Wakes, even if only incidentally, that's not quite fair, more than incidentally, it does have its moments, and I hope to show that. Now, both Hindle Wakes and Piccadilly are about transgressive love. Both stories confront class boundaries, those class boundaries that are so deeply embedded in British society. But they're not about an idealized true love, nor are they about grand passion, nor even are they about that old, I suppose one might say, chestnut of the working class girl seduced and abandoned by a man of the upper classes, as we might say in Hardy's Tess or Effie Dean's in Walter Scott's Heart of Midlothian. These are love affairs between a working class girl and her boss. In fact, in Hindle Wakes, it's the son of the boss. And they're transitory, primarily erotic, and their depiction of love is modern, marked by an aspiration to a world in which women were neither the idealized subjects of grand passion nor abject class victims. Now, I noticed with interest that on the box of the DVD of Hindle Wakes, a quotation from Emma Goldman is given, endorsing, as it were, across the decades, her opinion of Hindle Wakes. And although it gives a short quotation, I wanted to quote it in a little bit greater length. Emma Goldman, who was living in London at the time, the important anarchist and leftist political thinker, she says, "It's beginning to be felt in ever-growing circles that love is its own justification, requiring no sanction of either religion or law. The revolutionary idea, however, that a woman may, even as a man, follow the urge of her nature has never before been so sincerely and radically expressed as in Hindle Wakes. The message of Hindle Wakes is therefore of inestimable value inasmuch as it dispels the fog of silly sentimentalism and disgusting bombast that declares a woman a thing apart from nature, one who neither does nor must crave the joys of a life permissible to a man." Now, the film's modernity is encapsulated primarily in two forms. In the first instance, the two female protagonists, Fanny in Hindle Wakes and Shosho in Piccadilly, approach romance very much as erotic equals, not, as I said before, as victims of male sexual power. And nor, although seductive, and openly seductive, are they scheming seducers, though by the end of Piccadilly there's something of a femme fatale that clings to Shosho, but I'll come back to this question at the end. And then, as I said before, their romances are located in specific sites, which could be summed up, as I said, to both Miriam and to Foucault as heterotopias of vernacular modernism. And Miriam summed up her concept of vernacular modernism, and if she doesn't mind, I'll quote this very briefly, and she's quite entitled to say I've got the wrong end of the stick, but it is your words. "It was not just what these films showed, what they brought into optical consciousness, as it were, but the way they opened up hitherto unperceived modes of sensory perception and experience, their ability to suggest a different organization of the daily world." And essential to my points here is the way that the cinema visibly aspires to find an exhilarating style to convey these unperceived modes of sensory perception and experience, and how cinematically the scenes are filmed so as to transcend their immediate relevance to the stories. And in the first sequence I'm going to show you in a minute, I hope that sense of the power of cinema itself in visualizing these places will come out. And this is particularly the case in Dupont's flamboyant Piccadilly, which enables the audiences to participate in this extra thrill derived from the fictional scene's translation into a particularly flamboyant form on the screen. Now, topographies. The love stories of both films are predicated on this heterotopic environment provided by the kind of amusement sites that had grown up during the 1920s. These sites reflect the economic boom of the period, but they also bear witness to a revolution in the concept of commercial entertainment, its feminization, and in particular the mushrooming of dance halls as places of fun, flirtation, and the spectacular exhibition of this new femininity. It was, sorry, I'm pausing because I was thinking about this when I was writing it. I said it was particularly the young modern woman who wanted to dance, and I was wondering whether the young modern woman, as it were, dragged her reluctant boyfriend along with her, or whether actually there was also a new masculinity that could invest in the fun of the dance hall. But anyway, it came out rather one-sided, and I said particularly the young modern woman who wanted to dance, followed the new dance crazes, listened to the hits on the radio, bought the records, and then took or dragged their boyfriends to the dance halls. In the case of Piccadilly, the club's appeal to women is clearly stamped on the film's opening sequence, which is very significantly cited in The Ladies. It's a kind of wonderful, elaborate boudoir of velvet and mirrors and so on, in which the ladies can sit and gossip. And one elegant upper-class flapper says to another, now, if you haven't read the synopsis, I have to quickly say that the Piccadilly at the beginning was dominated by this show dance couple, Mabel and Vic, who perform in the club. And one elegant flapper says to another, what, never seen Vic? Without him there would be no one in the place, not a woman, that is. Thus, Vic is clearly understood to provide a visual pleasure for the female audience, as it took time off from the dance floor to enjoy champagne and male spectacle. It starts in the Ladies, and then I want to just get the sense of how the dance floor environment and the bar is set up. In Hindle Wakes, the amorous possibilities of the dance floor are preceded by an elongated sequence on Blackpool's famous roller coaster. And I think the film Hindle Wakes, set in the north of England, was also designed to showcase new attractions that had recently been added to the Blackpool Fun Fair. But also, and I think this is my key point here, and as in so many other contemporary movies of romance, fairground rides offer a means of a visual displacement, an exhilarating metaphor for sexual excitement. And I know Miriam's done a special study of the place of the fairground within romance in the late 1920s. That was the paper you gave for us in London. Oh. Do you remember? You've forgotten. Yeah. Yes. This is the moment when the boss's son, Alan, and Fanny get together in the fun fair in Blackpool. And Blackpool, I just hasten to say, is the Northern England equivalent of Coney Island. I hope you see the point there, that the couple who start off kind of slightly embarrassed and ill at ease with each other, by the end of the ride are actually in each other's arms. And the way in which this kind of displacement into the activity of the roller coaster is both displaying the attraction itself and acting as a metaphor for sexual excitement. But it seems to me that Hindle Wakes maps the Blackpool attractions into three phases, in which the couple's attraction to each other mutates into, finally, an actual affair. Flirtation develops into sex. If the roller coaster literally sets in motion the initial erotic excitement, the dance hall, which they then go on to in the next phase, allows the couple extended physical intimacy, an excuse for moving closer. So Alan and Fanny progress from a lively chat to dancing cheek to cheek. And finally the couple go outside to watch the famous Blackpool lights, the spectacular illuminations that had recently been installed. And here, as they sit on a bench, Alan and Fanny pay more attention to each other than to the illuminations, and when Alan whispers his proposal into Fanny's ear, she hesitates, then she nods, and then they kiss. This is the way in which, in that sense, the phases of romance are mapped out across the fairground. Now, Piccadilly, rather than, as it were, setting the heterotopia precisely in the holiday period, the Wakes period, when the cotton mill is closed, has a more complex, overarching topography. This echoes the way in which London's class division is inscribed into its geography. Culture, privilege, wealth are clustered in the West End, while the East End is the site of poverty and deprivation. Limehouse, in the East End, has long been home to a small Chinese community, and so Shosho, the young Chinese girl, can easily and credibly be integrated into this geography. She belongs both, as it were, to the Cockney East End and to the Chinese East End community, Limehouse. The spatial opposition between the Piccadilly, the club itself, and the East End is prefigured in miniature within the hierarchical division within the Piccadilly itself. As it says in the synopsis, at the beginning of the film, there's a disturbance among the diners as one slightly drunken diner played by Charles Lawton in his first ever appearance on film, interrupts the Mabel's solo. Valentine, the owner of the club, sets off on a journey of investigation to follow up the dirty mark in the plate. Shosho plays a doubly unconscious role here. First of all, the mark on the diner's plate, the eruption of disorder into the restaurant, asserts the hidden presence of the repressed, the scullery workers, at the back of the establishment, and it inserts their existence into the elegant propriety of the restaurant. In a kind of carnivalesque reversal, Shosho has transformed the site of labour and degraded labour at that into a distorted mirror of the heterotopic space in front. But the mark on the plate, the sign of the abject, on the register of the personal rather than the social unconscious, mutates for Valentine into a signifier of desire as he finally reaches the space of the scullery. just hope you can see here the way that Valentine's journey of investigation is also a trajectory from, as it were, the top of the hierarchy in the front of the restaurant, down, although this is a horizontal journey into the back of the establishment, it's also metaphorically a journey down into the lower depths of the scullery, which is also then extended, metonymically perhaps one could say, into London, the topography of London more generally. And the second journey at the end of the film, after Chouchou and Valentine have become a beginning of falling in love, becoming enveloped, as I said, say later in the lecture, by a kind of amour fou, Chouchou becomes a guide and takes Valentine to a pub in the East End, wanting, as she says, to show him our Piccadilly. And so there, in the sequence, rather towards the end of the film, we have a scene in a London East End working-class pub, which is set up in deliberate contrast to the way in which we were introduced to the Piccadilly in the first clip I showed. And this is also, in fact, includes the first moment of conscious erotic contact between Valentine and Chouchou. These topographies, East End, West End, the heterotopia of the Piccadilly, the heterotopia of the East End pub, materialize class differences, but they also represent space as a predominant trope of this film, which can refer to the kind of barriers that were also prevalent in the film industry at a time, cultural as well as national, that were being articulated and challenged. I now want to move on, having just mapped out those mappings, as it were. I want to describe the way in which the contemporary film industry was the base out of which these two films emerged. Sorry, I've lost my place. Right, and I want to try and indicate ways in which the British cinema's attempts to reinvent itself at this time can be located in wider economic conditions and might incidentally also explain the presence of Anna May Wong in this British film. Just as the modern confronts tradition, the trans-class romance draws attention to barriers and celebrates challenges to them. It was out of an economic crisis in the British film industry that these cultural issues gained visibility, and it's out of this economic, even slightly political substructure that the modernity of Piccadilly and Hindle Wakes, encapsulated by their female protagonists and their particular love stories, find a material economic purpose, crossing between the economic base and the visualization and the visualization in the films themselves. Now, I just want to make 4 points, 4 background points about the British film industry at the time. By the mid-20s, this is first point, by the mid-20s, Hollywood films accounted for 90% of the British box office. Others accounted for 5%, and the last 5% came from British production. So, as you can see, the British film industry was in one of its, I may say, periodic crises. Part of the problem was that Hollywood films appealed to the British and also to other European audiences, who are chafing under traditional gender roles and class structures. Hollywood cinema had a particular appeal to young women, and their restlessness attracted them to films that seemed to bring with them what I think of as the democracy of glamour that Hollywood brought to Europe. This was a phrase that I actually remember using for the first time at the Vernacular Modernism Day, which I associate very much with the Hollywood flapper film and how it spread the democracy of glamour through vernacular modernism around the world. To the English establishment, Americanization threatened the stability of Englishness and its social and moral traditions. And in 1927, the Daily Express, a right-wing popular newspaper, complained, "The British filmgoers talk America, think America, and dream America. We have several million people, mostly women, who to all intents and purposes are temporary American citizens." So as the British industry seemed to founder economically and was inflamed at the same time by cultural panic, this also related to the empire, but I can't go into this here, the 1927 Cinematographic Films Act was designed to lay the groundwork for state support and the refinancing of the film industry, and passed through Parliament and into law. Both Hindle Wakes and Piccadilly were made in the aftermath of the Act, out of the new financial opportunities it generated, and both of them, symptomatically, have American actresses in their lead roles in an acknowledgement of Hollywood's overriding power. Estelle Brody, who plays Fanny in Hindle Wakes, is American, and in Piccadilly, not only is there, of course, Anna May Wong, but there's also Gilda Gray, who plays the other leading lady. But crucially, both these films resist the moral panic that the Daily Express was whipping up. Their stories and their heroines are inseparable from the mentality of modernity, and they use the young modern woman as an iconic challenge to the traditional Englishness embedded in class boundaries and reactionary, conservative, one might even say inhibited, British sexual mores. Clearly, the revived industry felt it more important to address the average young female moviegoer than the readers of the Daily Express. And this instinct might well have also motivated the adaptation to film of Houghton's 1912 feminist classic, relocated in the much more generalized modern discourse of the late 1920s. Now, although this crisis was particular to Britain, and when has it ever not been, it was endemic throughout Europe, and with the German film industry as a partial expression. And in 1926, the New York Times correspondent in Paris, Martha Groening, summed up the situation. She, in a piece called The European Revolt Against Our Films, she said, in the face of the overwhelming prosperity of the American motion picture industry, any one European nation attempting to fight it seems very much like a pygmy up against a giant. And it was out of this perception that the first inklings of a transnational European cooperation began to appear. And at a conference sponsored by the League of Nations in Paris in 1926, Eric Pommer, as head of UFA, summed up the problem. He said, "I think that European producers must at last think of establishing certain cooperation among themselves. It's necessary to create European films, which will no longer be French, English, Italian or German films, but entirely continental films, expanding out into all of Europe." So the British industry, as it emerged into a new life in the aftermath of the 1927 Act, wanted to benefit from these new European initiatives, and the production company behind Piccadilly was called BIP, British International Pictures. Some people might say the idea of British and international is an oxymoron, but there it was, an oxymoron, but a symptomatic one. And with the Act's quota system, state support, tax breaks, and new financial investment, London became an immediate point of attraction for film professionals across Europe, and particularly from the UFA studios in Berlin. And so Piccadilly was born out of this combination of circumstances. German talent came to Britain. The film was directed by E.A. Dupont, shot by Werner Brandes, his cinematographer, designed by Alfred Junger, and all brought with them the highly developed technical skills and sophisticated cinematic style that I hope you've seen in the clips that I've shown you from Piccadilly. But also with them came Anna May Wong as the star of the film, who was also by that time an icon of the German film industry, where she'd been working for the previous 3 years. Anna May Wong had left Hollywood in the United States to become a German star. She was born to a third generation of a Chinese family in Los Angeles, and found her Hollywood career restricted by the paucity of parts available to her. Over and over again, the problem of miscegenation left her in supporting roles, unable to form part of a central romantic coupling essential for stardom. But she had established a certain international reputation and left Hollywood for Berlin in 1928. In Germany, although perhaps necessarily exoticized, she was received as American, modern, and as a Hollywood star. Films were constructed specially for her, her image was celebrated, and her access to leading roles and stardom was assured. And it was out of this success that British International Pictures offered her a contract. Inevitably, only a love story could do justice to the charisma and glamour of female stardom, and also fulfill the purpose behind the various commercial expectations at stake in this deal. Arnold Bennett was brought in to construct a London story for the Chinese-American actress. And I assume that Bennett was brought in partly due to his eminence in the UK, but he had actually a very large following in the US at the time, and had had a successful US lecture tour just before World War I. Now, looking back with hindsight, this is my third point, it's hard to realize, even at the end of the 1920s, the extent to which utopian principles of modernity were still part of contemporary mentalities. The crisis in the film industry, the British and the European, and its enforced attempts at international cooperation foregrounded the transnational, generating the rhetoric that I mentioned earlier of the universal, which then attached itself easily to the universal language of the cinema. In an article for the French journal Cinéa pour tous, the rejection of past nationalisms and the collective investment of cinema as emblematic of the modern and the dream of a better future is summed up. It says, "Remember the old idea, the spirit of the nation is formed on the battlefield, we would now add, it is only through collective endeavour, associated interests and common ideals that the spirit of internationalism is formed. Surely it will only be thus that peace can be secured, and it is the cinema that will be the sign today of a new page in the history of our ancient Europe. And perhaps more poignantly, a German reporter gave this account of his visit to the newly revived British film industry at the time when the German professionals were all arriving. He said, at Elstree being one of the main British studios, Elstree, Pinewood and so on. At Elstree, all the Englishmen speak broken German and all the Germans speak broken English. An international hodgepodge is emerging. One feels momentarily that a mutual understanding between peoples is possible through film. Brackets. Did we actually shoot at each other, you Elstree boys? Not only have the films made at Elstree reached the whole world seems now to come to Elstree. Now, this is one side of the picture. This kind of end of the, this kind of modern, this kind of utopianism of modernity, its belief in internationalism and its elevation of cinema to an emblem of international understanding. Utopian, and as indeed it was. But I just wanted to chart that in Britain, needless to say, there was an anti-foreigner backlash. One commentator said, one of the most extraordinary things about British pictures is that as a whole, they have never developed what we might call, for want of a better word, a British spirit. There's a tendency in this country to continentalise or Americanise our productions instead of working out our own salvation in our own distinctive way, expressing our own particular qualities, our home and general life. And that kind of mentality was indeed, as it were, at the core of the problem of the British mentality at the time. And someone, again, about DuPont, said, one can hardly expect this clever German director to realise the full British spirit in films, even if he tried to. Now, I want to come back to the two films, having, in a sense, kind of traced a detour through the British and the European quandaries at the time and the kind of discourse about cinema that was emerging out of them. I want to come back to the iconographies and character traits associated with Fanny and Shosho and consider the way that their appearance as young modern girls affects their attitudes to sexuality and desire. So that is how they represent the new attempt to create a more liberated approach to sex in British cinema, and also a new trans-border approach, a new crossing of boundaries and borders. And I want to show the scene in Hindle Wakes, Todd, this is the one called Shoes, in which to my mind establishes the way that the young girls working in the cotton mills had adapted their own vernacular modernism. And so now they've gone through their mutation from working girls in the cotton mill into flapper girls going off to Blackpool for Wakes Week. Now, the image of Shosho in Piccadilly is more complex. Anna May Wong brings to the part that a kind of democratic flapper style that had already been part of her image in her Hollywood days, off-screen and on. And her flapper image, as she saw it, was both American and Chinese, as the fashions, I think, as Miriam pointed out at the beginning, travelled very quickly around the world, and certainly were established and flourished in China during the late 20s and into the 30s. So Wong's modernity reflected both her American and her Chinese identities. And Shosho's image builds on her own gamine look, the fashionably slim, slightly androgynous figure. And in the film, this androgyny and modernity is set up very much to her advantage, in contrast to Gilda Gray's Mabel, who has an essentially fussy glamour. She's always wears feathers, furs, tight-waisted costumes that seem to associate her with older, pre-war fashions. And I just want to show you the shot of the two women next to each other. And so, again, although Anna May Wong kept her hair long, she always had it kind of up so that she could keep that an appearance of the kind of cropped flapper style, and wore very kind of slim clothes, short skirts. Thanks very much, George. And to extend the contrast further, poor Mabel is always having fainting fits and hysterics in her jealousy as Shosho becomes to take over Valentine's affections. And she seems to be more belonging to this old-fashioned Victorian femininity in contrast to Shosho's very cool and collected self-sufficiency. In the case of Hindle Wakes, Fanny is characterized very much, in fact, both the young women are characterized by intelligence and courage. And I just want to show you the scene at the end of Hindle Wakes when Fanny declares her independence. Hindle Wakes is quite frequently compared to A Doll's House and the ending to Nora, and I feel that this is really a misapprehension. Fanny is not only a working class girl, she's much more kind of confident and sure of herself than Nora. And at the end, she's able to articulate to Alan the actual nature of their affair. So her modernity lies not only in her flapper style and her sexual freedom, but also, and I think in fact even more so, in her ability to analyse their relationship and to locate it in terms of gender and equality of the sexes in sex, within a sexual affair. I think it's also crucial that at the end of the movie, when she moves out of her home, that she makes it clear that her sexual independence is based on her economic self-sufficiency. When she says, "I'm a Lancashire lass, and as long as they're spinning cotton in Lancashire, I can earn enough to keep me respectable." Now, ultimately, the two films' origins determine their different dramatic modes and the diverging fates of their heroines. Estelle Brodie plays Fanny without any pretense at star quality, but Piccadilly is more complicated and has to veer away from the depiction of Shosho simply as a modern working girl. Once she becomes a star, the contradictions of her image reflect those of Anna May Wong herself. Wong brings her star quality to Shosho's persona as the girl in the scullery who becomes London's latest dancing hit. But once a star, the exoticism of the persona comes to the fore, and the story begins to drift away from its modernity, unable to deal with the contradictions and falling back on a death ending. And Anna May Wong was very aware of this death syndrome. She'd complained when she left America that it was sad to have to die so often. And although she became a major star in Europe, the same narrative fate followed her. She died in all her German films, and then again in Piccadilly. But in Piccadilly, Shosho is very far from a victim until the end. And the specifically located working class background, Limehouse, mitigates her exoticism. While in Hindle Wakes the love affair is a mutual, equal, and for both a passing fancy, the contradictory aspects of Piccadilly make it more interesting, but also complicated by the problems besetting the depiction of an interracial romance. Were the film to succeed, it would have to succeed in America, where the rules about screen representations of so-called miscegenation were strict. And this was one reason why Anna May Wong had never been able to make it to the first rank, or one reason. And the scenes implying a sexual relation between the couple could only be limited. And I'll show you the way that Valentine and Shosho's kiss is shot at the end. It was shot, but cut from the final version. And Anna May Wong mentioned specifically her regret that this particular taboo couldn't be broken in Piccadilly. So from this perspective, it seems that the romance between Valentine and Shosho, once fully sexualized, Shosho's persona would be overtaken by that otherness that leads to what we could think of as narrative execution, when Shosho has, in a sense, to be killed off at the end of the movie. But behind that, there's a kind of powerful amour fou, that amour fou so dear to the surrealists, that develops between them. And their mutual attraction is depicted through exchanges of looks, and this erotic balance is maintained by underplaying the voyeuristic gaze, and their physical relationship develops around a series of gestures which gradually lead up to the final love scene. Anna May Wong, and I'm just kind of coming to the end now, I hope not too late. Anna May Wong in Piccadilly comes across very much more than a character in fiction. She was a supreme point of attraction for the camera. She was beautifully lit, framed, and filmed. Piccadilly essentially celebrates Anna May Wong's photogenie, the quality that French theorists of the 1920s identified as specific to cinema, encapsulated whether it might have been of the relationship of the camera to an object, a landscape, or a face. And in this love story, photogenie is enhanced as emotion is materialized in its turn. And Wong's performance in Piccadilly revolves around details of gesture and look, mediating the texture of the film and the emotional events of the story. And I just want to show you the love scene between Valentine and Shosho at the end. And notice the way in which it's intercut with Mabel's shadow, which is kind of hovering over them as she waits outside, and the way in which the kiss is cut for American audiences. Now, Tim Bergfelder, in an article on Anna May Wong's European image, comments on the way that its inherent contradiction had a particular significance for the contemporary European film industry. He says, the fact that her image was bound up in contradiction and conflicting cultural perceptions was not an obstacle, but contributed to the success of her image. In other words, Wong's persona functioned to some extent as a free signifier, which could be imbued with various meanings. From the beginning, Wong's European producers and directors aimed at rendering her exotic identity indeterminate and therefore easily consumable. But I'd like to add to Bergfelder's argument the point in which I've been dwelling in this presentation. In addition to Wong's qualities as a free-floating signifier and this kind of amorphous exoticism, she also brought the specific resonances of the young modern woman. And this modern femininity, as depicted both in Piccadilly and Hindle Wakes, could make a key contribution to an international mode of address at this moment of crisis within both the British and the European film industries. Sorry, I went on rather long. That's it.